Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. I'm Jim Scott, and I'm President and CEO of Applied Policy. My colleagues and I host these gatherings to share information and exchange ideas with you on important health policy issues. On August 16, 2022, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law. While the new law aims to reduce the federal deficit, spends billions of dollars on energy and climate change, and hopes to modernize and expand the Internal Revenue Service, it also contains a number of healthcare-related provisions. Some of those changes relate to the Medicare program and make significant changes to Medicare prescription drug coverage. Today, we'll focus on one of the key Medicare-related provisions of the Act, which requires the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, to negotiate prices for certain drugs covered under the Medicare program. The program will start with 10 high-spending single-source drugs for 2026, increasing that number to 20 by 2029. We expect the first 10 drugs selected for negotiation to be announced by CMS on September 1st. Right now, CMS is in the midst of developing its drug pricing negotiation program. Instead of traditional notice and comment rulemaking, the new law requires CMS to implement the drug price negotiation program by program instruction or other forms of program guidance. To that end, CMS released its initial program guidance in March and allowed only a 30-day public comment period. The agency said it intends to release its revised guidance this summer. In addition to that guidance, CMS is also releasing information collection requests, also known as ICRs, which are required under the Paperwork Reduction Act to address the public burden of completing government forms. CMS has issued 2 of these requests so far, in March and April. Our panel today is comprised of experts who have been closely following the CMS's implementation of this new program. Today, we'll learn from them what it might mean for the organizations they lead, for patients, and for pharmaceutical companies. Now, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have John Michael O'Brien, President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Pharmaceutical Council. Also, we're joined by Jason Spangler, Chief Executive Officer of the Innovation and Value Initiative, and Monet Stanford, Director of Policy at the Association for Accessible Medicines. Thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start by asking each of you, how does the Medicare drug price negotiation program impact your organization and its work, and what is top of mind for you? So let's start with you, John.
Well, thanks, Jim, for having us, and thanks everybody who's online. It's an honor to be a part of the forum. I'd have to first say that I don't see this as a negotiation, or at least not the definition of negotiation that I'm most used to. This is accept a price or face a giant tax. But when I think about what's best for everybody, is the importance of a transparent and predictable process that provides more opportunities for input than CMS originally described in the guidance. So, that's where our focus is right now, is trying to make sure that the agency has the most opportunity for input from patients, most importantly, from clinicians who have experience treating patients with the conditions that may be focused on first, as well as manufacturers who certainly know a lot about the science behind their products and have been having similar conversations about the clinical benefits of their products against therapeutic alternatives for quite some time.
Thanks, John. Jason?
Thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone for being a part of this webinar. I'm going to build, Jim, a little bit on what John said. I think it's really important to get inputs from all the stakeholders, particularly those that typically haven't been part of this process, which are patients. And so, that's one of the focuses of my organization. But I would also probably take a step back a little bit and say, I think a lot depends on the implementation of this. So as we try to shape that implementation, or at least influence or impact it a little bit, I think it depends on how CMS reacts to this, because not only do I think this is an opportunity for them in the ways that John described, but it's also an opportunity to actually look at, what we spend and what is valuable, what we determine, that could be valuable when it comes to these sorts of medicines, and something that I don't think CMS has really ever done. And so obviously another focus of our organization is to help determine value, particularly from the patient's perspective. And so I think this is an opportunity, but like John mentioned, I'm not sure they're going to take that opportunity, because I think they're just focused on kind of bringing down the prices as low as possible. But hopefully they'll consider value and the value and the different aspects of value of these medicines, particularly obviously for their beneficiaries.
Thanks, Jason. And Monet, what's top of mind for you?
Yep, thank you, Jim. And like everyone else, thank you for having us here today. So for those of you who don't know, the Association for Accessible Medicines is a trade association that represents generic and biosimilar manufacturers. So that's kind of the perspective I'll try to add to this conversation today. But really at the heart of it and the intent of this legislation lies the pursuit of access to affordable medications, which of course is the aim of generic and biosimilar manufacturers. So we agree that we'd like to continue to engage with the agency and provide this specific perspective. The statute and the guidance documents both make clear that generic and biosimilar entry is critical to the pharmaceutical ecosystem. So we look forward to all of the different ways in which we can perhaps provide specific instances where market competition is the best way to lower prices versus some of these other statutorily required mechanisms that are in place.
Thanks, Monet. And Jason, what incentives do you see that the program creates, and how would these incentives affect innovation and access for prescription drugs for Medicare beneficiaries and other patients in the United States?
Well, I mean, when I first hear incentives with this program, my mind immediately goes to kind of negative incentives, Jim, because I think there are some negative incentives in here, particularly from the manufacturer's perspective of, when do they want to launch based on the timelines that they have when they might become part of this list? Will they delay launch in certain areas, in multiple indications, because, there's basically a focus on the first indication and we don't know what's going to happen with other indications afterwards. And so will they be looking to the science with other indications for certain drugs that they're developing? So I think there's some potentially negative incentives for innovation. I don't think we know the impact of that. I mean, we've seen numbers from, CBO saying, 3 to 5 less drugs over 10 years, and other people have said, over 100 less drugs. I mean, I don't think we know. I think it's probably somewhere in the middle. So I think those are some of the negative incentives. I think some of the positive incentives is because there are these timelines of when the drugs could be part of this, list, when they're going to be evaluated or assessed by CMS and be part of the negotiations. There's a lot of incentive, I think, to focus on real world data and real world evidence in these drugs. I mean, that's the evidence that CMS is going to look at. And by the time they're potentially on the list, you're going to know a lot about these drugs already. It's going to be very different than, the drugs at launch. And so you're going to have a lot of information. And I think that will incentivize even more so the manufacturers to actually, look into that data even more, and maybe even do hopefully more studies around that, and even retrospective as well as prospective kind of real world evidence studies. So I think there is a little bit of an incentive for that. For CMS, I think the only incentive is just to get the price as low as possible. And I think that's what their goal is. And it'd be great if we could kind of change that incentive for them to focus more on, again, like I said before, value and what's best for the beneficiaries. I think the access incentives are interesting only because, lowering the price through this, quote, negotiation with the manufacturer, I'm not sure how much of an impact it's going to have regarding access, only because of the benefit design components that are already in the IRA, where there's already a copay cap, right? And so, the beneficiaries are only going to have to pay so much anyways. And so getting the price even lower of the drug, I'm not sure if that's going to have an access impact or an incentive for greater access or even more affordable access at that point. particularly when you look at the potential initial lists, which are going to be Part D drugs, and this is, the cap is Part D and Part D redesign. So I think there are some questions about whether it's going to incentivize, more access for patients. But I'll stop there, and I'm sure there's other, answers that the fellow panelists will talk about.
Thanks, Jason. And so, John, what's your take on how the new law will affect innovation?
Well, I think now it's my turn to build on what Jason just said. I really worry that we're underestimating the impact that this law will have on the ecosystem that delivers new treatments to cures, and patients will ultimately be the ones who suffer. So there are three incentives to manufacturers that I read as being sent. While we don't entirely know how this process is going to work, and there's still a lot of uncertainty, what I see is that the 9-year price fixing window will kick in and discourage drug companies from conducting clinical trials to pursue the additional indications or the subsequent indications that Jason was just talking about. That'll be particularly devastating in cancer care, where you rarely launch into a marketplace first line. I think this law will also skew R&D budgets away from small molecule drugs, particularly for diseases that target older populations. That's bad for seniors or people like me or all of us who will be seniors someday, hopefully. And the orphan drug definition and the clock that CMS is using, I think really discourages companies from pursuing additional orphan designations. And that's bad for people with rare diseases, especially when 95% of rare diseases don't have treatments or cures today. As for incentives for plans, I want to double down on what Jason said. I think there's a potential for some concern about how plans cover a Part D drug, but may not necessarily provide at least the same access to it as some of the other drugs. So we're launching this law on top of a chassis that's already ripe for perverse incentives. And I think Monet likely has some concerns there about what that means for biosimilar and generic competition. But I also want to give a hat tip to something that Dr. McClellan at CMS Brookings, Dr. McClellan, former CMS administrator, now at the Duke Brookings Center, has put out into the policy discussion, is that CMS doesn't necessarily have to send these negative signals. They have regulatory discretion to decide what drugs that are eligible for negotiation actually get negotiated. And I think there's a really important opportunity for CMS to use that flexibility and tell the marketplace that they're not interested in negotiating prices for drugs that are being developed for unmet medical needs, oncology, rare populations, et cetera.
Thanks, John. Monet, John alluded to that AAM has raised concerns that negotiating drug prices under Medicare as laid out in the Inflation Reduction Act would have a chilling effect on the development of generics and biosimilars. Which elements of the new law cause that, and how do you see them impacting development over time?
Yeah, Jim, our concerns are very similar to Jason's and John's. The timelines are iffy for us. We are generic and biosimilar manufacturers. We already operate on very tight margins. That's been the business since the inception of the Hatch-Waxman Act. So with the timelines, generic manufacturers make decisions on whether or not they plan to pursue a molecule within the first 1 to 3 years. And then the reference product has 12 to 14 years for a small molecule and then 15 years for a biologic. It's tough for generic and biosimilar manufacturers to determine if they're going to be entering a market that's cut at 90%, 60%, or 35%. But they essentially just have to make those gambles. I actually heard the other day that a few years ago in the generics market, a generic manufacturer would make a profit on a third of their products, break even on a third of their products, and lose money on a third of their products. And it's shifting to the more 50, 50, 60, 40. It's going to be really tough to make those decisions 10, 15 years in advance and determine if they're going to be a sustainable industry going forward. Also similar to Jason and John, there's getting the product to the market, and then there's access, which we could talk about all day, but I know this webinar is specifically focused on the negotiation provisions. But there are so many structures within the Part D program that prevent the initial entry of generic and biosimilar molecules that it makes it challenging, even when they can get on market, to get these low-cost affordable drugs to patients.
Thanks, Monet. So let's turn the conversation to CMS's initial guidance, those information collection requests or ICRs that I referred to. CMS released its initial guidance on March 15th, 2023. Comments closed on April 14th, 2023, and then we'll get the guidance this summer. What was your first reaction when reading CMS's the main guidance document on the Medicare drug price negotiation program? Let's start with John.
Well, thanks, Jim. You know, I think my mind went first to the process that they described, starting with the selection of a therapeutic alternative. And as a pharmacist, I'm sure I had the same thought that many did, which was, I can identify a therapeutic alternative that we haven't used since the time of sword fighting if I'm interested in trying to just drive to a low price. And then I began to think about all the innovations that we've had in some of these therapeutic areas, not just on the mechanism of action side, but the way that drugs are delivered in terms of delivery device or dosing frequency. And then I just began to wonder, when CMS starts thinking about the therapeutic alternative they select and the clinical benefits of the products that they're considering, are they going to think about all the important preferences that patients have and that clinicians are used to thinking about when picking a more modern or innovative treatment that may have better efficacy, better safety, or a more favorable dosing frequency? So again, I think for me, it all starts with, how are they identifying the therapeutic alternative? I hope they're not going to go off label. I hope they're not going to pick really old drugs just to try to drive this to the bottom. And then everything to me flows from there.
Let's go to Monet next. What was your initial reaction to the CMS guidance that came out in March?
Honestly, my initial reaction, based on the time that it came out, was I'll be reading this all night. But in all seriously, we appreciated the cadence in which the information was released in relation to the implementation of the other provisions that came out right after the deadline for the guidance on the inflationary rebate comments. So we appreciated that continued drumbeat of information being pushed to stakeholders to evaluate. But I will take a slightly different take than John's interpretation of how the drugs will be ranked. And I'm actually curious to see how this will pan out. If you remember, this bill was passed through a reconciliation vehicle, meaning everything had to be budgetary in nature. And the statute intentionally left little discretion in the portion that discussed the selection of drugs. So when the guidance came out and there wasn't additional information on how the products would be ranked, it is our assumption that once the gross is surmised, CMS would calculate the drugs 1, 2, 3 down the list. So that was kind of a surprise to me, that there wasn't information on how they might include additional factors explicitly. As you mentioned at the top, Jim, it was notable and explicit that the guidance was not subject to the formal notice and comment rulemaking process. We had a few things to say there, but we do hope to see that as an option in future correspondence.
Thanks, Monet. And Jason, what was your initial reaction to the initial guidance?
My initial reaction, Jim, was regarding what's missing. I just felt like there were a lot of things missing, and whether that was kind of clarification about certain definitions that have been discussed a little bit, like, therapeutic alternatives and unmet need, and really kind of clarifying what they meant by that, but also kind of larger things that were missing. And one is no mention of health equity in there. And I know we might get to that later, but it's the number one, they're the first pillar in CMS's strategic plan, and there's nothing related to that really, in depth as there should be. And then the other is related to something we had talked about earlier, is just, where is the patient community as part of this process? They mentioned a little bit about patient engagement. I know they've done patient engagement where they've had conversations with actual patients and patient advocacy organizations, but there's no kind of systematic or formalized aspect of the guidance that has patients part of it. And I think this is another opportunity for them to do that. So my initial reaction is things that we're missing that, we hope CMS would include as part of the process and implementation moving forward.
Thanks, Jason. So in the press release for the initial guidance, Secretary Becerra stated that the program would promote competition in the market. What is your assessment of how the program will impact competition, and what can CMS do to better promote competition within the Inflation Reduction Act framework? Let's go back to John.
Why do I always have to keep going first? In all seriousness, I think that there are some anti-competitive effects in here, especially when you think about launching this process into a marketplace that is already rife with perverse incentives. And I am very interested in how plans are ultimately going to implement this. I also think, it has the potential to send different signals to different marketplaces or books of business. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the spillover into the commercial market, and then the spillover into provider markets. Not since the posting of the first DRGs have we seen a situation where the government is putting a price list up on its website. And I think there's going to be a natural opportunity for commercial plans to want to look at that list and start rethinking about the conversations that they're having. Now, again, whether that causes a conversation based on value and getting the right patient, the right drug to lower total cost of care, as opposed to causing a doubling down on rebates and an increase in prior authorization and utilization management, remains to be seen. But I'm more pessimistic than I am optimistic. I also think when I look at the gap between MFP +6 that outpatient providers are going to face versus MFP, or the MFP +6 versus the 340B that some safety net outpatient providers and their satellite clinics have the opportunity to acquire drugs at, I think it has the potential to put those non-340B community providers at risk for consolidation. And again, I think the spillover is something that we're really interested in studying.
Thanks, John. And Jason, would the Inflation Reduction Act promote competition and or not?
From my perspective, it's hard for me to see that, just because I don't think the focus, despite what the secretary said, is actually on creating competition. I think the focus is just minimizing prices and bringing prices down. And so I think because that is the focus and the incentives that come from that, I think the different stakeholders are going to try to figure out a way to deal with that. And then if they have to make up that some other way, whether that's, increase launch prices, whether that's, the spillover that John mentioned in the private market, trying to get increased revenue potentially from the private market, how that's going to work. I think all of the stakeholders will try to deal with how this kind of works. So I don't really think it's going to help necessarily competition. What it might do, and I'd be interested in Monet's thoughts on this, is, some have described this as patent reform without actually doing patent reform. Because if the price that CMS wants would basically be what the price would be of a generic of this brand drug, you're just moving the time frame up to when it's genericized. And I don't know if that would increase kind of competition. I think that would maybe decrease kind of competition, going back to the concern that Monet mentioned earlier about actually wanting to get into the market. with a generic or a biosimilar at that point. So I don't really see a lot of competition. I mean, the last thing I'll say about this, Jim, is, you know, the area that they're focusing on is drugs that don't have any competition, right? That are a monopoly. And so is that going to incentivize, you know, more manufacturers to produce drugs in a market where there's already a large class? I don't know. You know, they already kind of get criticized for doing that because they're Me Too drugs anyway. And so it's kind of like they're in a no-win situation from that perspective. So I doubt there's going to be a lot of increased competition because of this.
So let's pause on that for just a second. So the initial list is going to be what insiders call small molecule drugs or Medicare Part D drugs. To regular folks, those are pills you fill often at the retail or mail order pharmacy, as opposed to products that are usually administered by a physician or a healthcare professional through an infusion. So for the small molecule market, what about the law disincentivizes their development and the impact and what impact will that have on patients? We talked about it a little bit, but could you unpack that a little bit more?
No, I think Jason, you know, touched on this when he called it sort of patent reform without patent reform, right? You're essentially cutting off the back half of your peak sales period. Now, it's important to note that this law is going to affect companies differently at different times. So if I'm already on the market and have been on the market for the 7, 9, 11, what have you years to either be eligible for or ultimately subject to negotiation, that's going to affect me differently than if I, as a manufacturer, just made a decision to launch a product into a certain indication based on certain assumptions, especially if that's you know, an orphan designation, you know, with one or more orphan indications. But then there's also the population of products that haven't been launched yet, assets that may be earlier in you know, their clinical development journey, or development hasn't even been begun yet. So the decisions that I make for 3 of those different product lifecycle scenarios are all going to be very different, and there's a whole constellation of things to think about, particularly in classes that have the potential to be crowded, right? I don't like the term Me Too, right? Because I can think of the statin class, I can think of the angiotensin receptor blocker class, I can think of the SSRI class, and I can tell you as a pharmacist that there are different patients that I'm going to give different drugs in those classes to. They also have the effect of creating competition within the class. So to say that this law is focusing only on drugs that don't have competition, no, it's focusing on drugs that don't have generic or biosimilar competition. And if I know that I have a product that's going to be in a competitive class and an earlier drug has the potential to have an MFP, that's going to have the potential of essentially subjecting me to a bad comp, right? Or a bad comparative price within the class. So I think that's not only how it has the potential to disincentivize small molecule development or disincentivize the pursuit of additional indications for small molecule products, it also describes in more detail how I don't see this law as being pro-competitive at all.
Thanks, John. Monet, how do you see the new law impacting competition?
Yeah, we have an interesting perspective because our preference in the implementation of this law is do no harm to the current economic barriers put in place. We prefer for the market to function in the way that the Hatch-Waxman Act and BPCIA intended for it to function. One thing about the generic market, once a product reaches its loss of exclusivity and a generic manufacturer successfully challenges that patent, yes, it's true that prices do go down. The way this law is set up, it encourages the entry of one generic molecule. However, the way the generic market works, it works best when there are multiple generic entrants. So one molecule enters the market, the price goes down significantly, but there's a very popular FDA statistic that states that once 6 or more generic molecules enter the market, prices go down at least 95%. So what our goal is to pursue a path that not only encourages the introduction of one entrant, but lets the market operate in that pure play free market method that it was intended to. And then also for biosimilars, they're a fairly new market. The first biosimilar was introduced in 2015, and they're already starting to deliver savings, not only on the biosimilar prices, but also on the corresponding brand price. But again, having these entrants in the system don't matter if there's no access by way of formulary concerns or other issues that we have with the Part D program.
Thanks, Monet. And we have a question from the audience. So they hypothesize that shouldn't the incentive for pharma companies be what drugs will do the most good and fill the greatest need, and not what will make us the most money, which seems to be the argument being made today. Jason, can you share your thoughts on that first, and then we'll allow the other panelists?
Sure. If that's the argument that's coming through, then I don't think that's the argument we're trying to make. That's not the argument I'm trying to make. I think the argument I'm trying to make around incentives is that, you know, there needs to be incentives to innovate, right? And obviously that is related to, you know, revenue and what comes for each company, so that they can take that and put it back into R&D. As we know, you know, so many drugs fail for every one that succeeds, right? Historically, it's kind of a 9-to-1 ratio. And so, you know, if there isn't revenue to help innovate, or, you know, then they're not going to be able to innovate and develop those drugs. So whoever asked that question, I agree. The incentive is to develop those drugs in those areas where there's unmet need or the greatest need, or there aren't therapies at all to begin with, like Alzheimer's. And so, you know, but there needs to be incentives to do that. There needs to actually be revenue for the companies to put into R&D to actually do that. And there's a complex system, you know, with companies related to how they do research and development, and investors that, you know, obviously put money towards helping them do that, but they want a return as well. And so there's that complex system. But I agree, it is to, you know, to develop drugs where there is the greatest need, or there's no drugs currently, or where there is, you know, unmet need. But there needs to be an incentive to do that. And if anything puts incentives to not do that, which there are aspects of the IRA that does actually do that, then you are probably going to have less innovation. So and it's not about earning money or anything like that. I think it is about, you know, is there enough incentive to innovate, and then is there funding to actually do the R&D to create that innovation?
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, Jim, I'm not sure if they're watching the same webinar that I am, because when I think about the products we're talking about, right, and in just my lifetime, we've developed a cure for hepatitis C. We've turned HIV/AIDS and some cancers into chronic conditions that are being managed at home. But these are also risky businesses, and these are big bets. So for the reasons that Jason just described, you know, like it or not, investment follows return. And if we start sending the wrong incentives in a marketplace that's fraught with risk, unfortunately, the people on the front end of those capital decisions might not be so interested in sponsoring the golden era of innovation that we've experienced in my lifetime.
So listening to all of you, it seems to me like one of the thoughts behind the new law is that negotiating lower drug prices will increase patient access to drugs and thereby improve patient health outcomes. Do you agree that the law, is that what will happen, or is there, do those steps not automatically follow one another?
Well, I want to believe that we will someday have a marketplace that values the medical cost offsets and benefits to patients that innovation provides. And we can start including drugs in total cost of care models and focusing on patients getting healthier and saving the system money. This has, and always will be a science-based industry, and that's where the focus is, for me today.
Jason, is that a logical progression of what this law is trying to do? Lower prices, therefore at lower prices, more patients get drugs that their doctors prescribe, and therefore patients have better health outcomes?
I think it's more complicated than that. I don't think it's a linear progression. There's a lot of steps in between. And I think even if you have decreased access on one hand, I think there are ways within the system to try to increase access in other ways and try to make up for that. So I don't think you can actually naturally go there. I think if you see, over a longer period of time, decreased access to innovative therapies, and whether they're drugs or devices or whatever, digital health, I think over the long term, potentially, but there are so many other factors that play into health outcomes in our society, right? And so, medical care itself, which I would include this under, is only a small percentage. And I'm a population health, public health guy, and so I think there's a lot of other ways to affect health outcomes besides this. But I think over the long term, and if you look in certain parts of the world where we have a little bit more evidence of this, you could potentially see that, and particularly in certain disease areas where there isn't access to certain therapies, and then you don't see the outcomes that are as good in those specific disease conditions. That potentially could happen, but I think there's a lot of steps along the way that hopefully could remedy that, at least in the short and medium term.
Monet, what are your thoughts?
They essentially align with John and Jason. Just to back up a little bit, the concern around lack of access or lack of incentive to continue the production of innovative medication for us lies in the fact that the MFP, the maximum fair price, will apply to a qualifying single source drug, despite the innovations that have been included. So that aggregation term is a huge concern for us, because once we successfully challenge patents and we find a way to get on the market, if we're met with this ceiling of an MFP, despite all of the innovations that either occurred or not occurred, those are the same costs for us. And the purpose of the generic and biosimilar industry is to offer a sustainable, low-cost option for patients. If we choose not to go into these markets because we're being met with a capped price, despite an impact or an increase on a drug device combination, if you look at the Lantus Toujeo example, or et cetera, the likelihood that 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line, generic and biosimilar manufacturers will still be in this business is unlikely, and that therein lies a concern on adherence for patients.
Thanks, Monet. So the process for identifying drugs, the top 10 list we're looking forward to in September, was one of the most anticipated sections of the implementation guidance. Which of this section's elements offer the most clarity, and where are there opportunities to refine the forecast for interested stakeholders seeking to ensure proper interpretation? Let's start with Jason first.
It's a tough question, I think, from our perspective and how we look at, the different sections. Again, I would go back to, what is necessarily, missing, where there's opportunities to kind of expand what certain definitions are, and defining, what evidence that CMS is actually looking for to meet those definitions that they haven't really given clarity on. So like when I think of, for example, unmet needs. So I know I'm kind of answering this the other way, Jim, of areas that don't offer a lot of clarity. I think when they're talking about kind of specific data that they want, R&D data, information about a certain drug, I think there's clarity in their mind what that is. I think what we don't see is that it's much more complicated than that, right? You don't have, and having previously worked in the industry, you don't have like a set number of this is exactly what we spent on R&D, right, for a specific molecule, right? You might have some information about clinical trials and how much those cost. But because you're developing things not in a vacuum, but a part of your entire R&D strategy, it's kind of complicated, right? Those numbers. And so even though I think there seems to be clarity and specifics in those sorts of sections about, the actual costs that maybe a manufacturer has, or some of the comparative effectiveness evidence, which I think is pretty clear as well, I think it's more complicated than that. So I actually think that, again, clarity, or helping apart from the definitions that they're asking for, but just even specifics about understanding the process that manufacturers that are providing this information have that information and how to collect it, I think would be helpful from CMS's perspective. And so I don't know if that really answers the question, Jim, but I think a lot of the evidence on how it works and outcomes and stuff like that, and maybe some of the clinical trial data and stuff like that, but just overall R&D costs and similar type of asks that they're talking about, it's much more complicated than just providing a number or a range of numbers.
Thanks, Jason. John, was the process for identifying drugs that will be selected for the top 10 list released in September clear enough for manufacturers to know whether their specific drug is affected, or is it more of a guessing game?
I'll go back to what I said at the top of the call, right? Which is that there was a lot that wasn't in there. And if I'm watching this space with concern, I'm looking for a transparent, predictable, and reproducible process that will allow me to plan. I also think to the elements that you were talking about, therapeutic alternative, clinical benefit, unmet need, 30-day supply, et cetera. They put out something for people to react to. I didn't read it as like, hey, here's what our real plan is. I read it as like, here's something for folks to react to. We know we're going to get some feedback on this. And when I look at limiting opportunities for manufacturers to engage to 3 conversations post initial offer, and you have to set your notes on fire in a trash can outside the Humphrey building when you leave, I think that falls short of what a good two-way conversation to inform everything from the selection of therapeutic alternatives all the way on to the appropriate methods for real world evidence is needed.
And Jim, can I interject real quick? Sorry, I think I answered a different question than you asked. And sorry, I was more trying to answer the question regarding what information, if you are in negotiation, that CMS is requiring. So I apologize. I think I would agree with John. I think there's probably enough evidence to give a good guess and about, whether or not your drug's going to be selected. I know that there are companies that are already anticipating that their drug is going to be in list and they're preparing for that. But to John's point, I think, there's going to be, manufacturers who put a lot of work into this, and it might not be for anything, or it might not be exactly what CMS is looking, for. And so I think on both, whether you're on the list, and then if you're on the list, what you're actually supposed to submit, I think there's going to be a lot of questions about, is this exactly what CMS is looking for? So I apologize for that.
No, thank you, Jason. And both Jason and John, your organization submitted comments on the proposed guidance. Jason, can you tell me a little bit about the comments that IVI submitted and why?
Yeah, sure. And I'll go first, John, for you this time, and Jim called. Some of it is, we had several major themes, some that I already talked about. One was, this shouldn't be about minimizing prices only. It should be about maximizing values for the beneficiaries. And going back to another question you asked, Jim, isn't this really about health outcomes for Medicare beneficiaries? Isn't that what we should focus on? What's best for them? So that was one of them. The other I mentioned, and we might get into this a little bit later, is around health equity. There's nothing around health equity. I think we all realize that's a really important issue that needs to be incorporated into everything that we do in healthcare, and Medicare has even stated that. CMS, has stated that within Medicare and their other programs. I mentioned about patient engagement and getting the patient voice in there. I also mentioned kind of the clarity about definitions, but one other area that I would go into that we focus on is the methodologic approach they're going to use. They talk about qualitative, approach, but they don't talk about what that is. And there is a lot of quantitative data as well as qualitative. So I think there needs to be more explanation about what we call, in health economics, a mixed methods approach. How are you going to use both qualitative and quantitative data? And when it comes to that qualitative approach, what qualitative data is going to be acceptable to CMS? There's also some questions. I'm not going to get into the quality, and they're not allowed to use the quality, and they emphasize not using the quality. But there's still an open interpretation about, well, what alternatives? Are you going to use any alternatives? And that just discourages me that they're actually really focused on value. They're not really thinking about even how to measure it, even if they're not allowed, obviously, to use the quality, which they can't. And then the last thing that part of our comments is, again, it's a great opportunity in so many ways for CMS to actually change how we do things. But I didn't see kind of forward-looking kind of long-term strategy from them. And part of it is because they're restricted, right? They're restricted by the statute in some ways. They're restricted severely by the timelines that they're under pressure to meet. And so I think they're myopic, and not in a a negative way or derogatory towards them, but that's how they have to be. There's so many things they have to do in a short amount of time that it's really hard for them to be forward looking and thinking long term. But I think they should be trying to do that at the same time.
Thanks. And John, can you give us the highlights of NPC's comments?
Yeah, I think everything I've said on this call has been a highlight of our comments. And like my fellow panelists, I'm sure you could sit us in a dark room with a pencil and 15 sheets of paper, and we could probably rewrite our comments for you because we've spent so many times with these. But again, I'm focused on a transparent and predictable process that provides opportunity for input from patients, clinicians that are experienced with treating the conditions that are under consideration, and manufacturers who have giant teams of scientists, not just on the pharmaceutic side, but also on the pharmacoeconomic side, who are used to having conversations about how their products stack up to competition. Involving them early in the conversation as opposed to closing them out until an initial offer is initiated, doesn't lead to good policy. I think we also double down on the importance of the patient voice. We also double down on the importance of good methods and high quality evidence. We've seen some organizations in the United States conduct comparative effectiveness reviews or cost effectiveness analyses. And in those conversations, manufacturers submit reams and reams of high quality data that unfortunately is left on the cutting room floor. So I think one other theme that you hear in our comments is the importance of high quality evidence and the clarity that allows someone to prepare for this conversation whenever it is that their number is called.
Thanks, John. And Monet, before we move on to the next topic, do you have what's most important to AAM about the initial guidance? And did you see in it what you expected to see, or are there concerns that affect generics and biosimilars that weren't adequately addressed?
Yeah, absolutely. And at risk of sounding like a broken record, we too seek clarity and transparency on the construction of this process, but specifically for generic and biosimilar manufacturers. Like Jason said, there's what wasn't in it and what was in it. And there was this term bona fide marketing, which surprised us a bit. The statute said in order for a product to be removed from consideration for selection for negotiation, a generic or biosimilar must be approved and available on the market. So this marketed term was something that was somewhat vague. Approval, you can go straight to the FDA, you can get that information fairly easily, but marketed is subjective. The guidance document, when introduced, had this term bona fide marketing, which seems to give CMS some form of discretion in determining a volume of sales that has to be seen in the channel, in order for the generic or biosimilar to appropriately qualify to have that reference product removed. And we're just not sure how that's going to play out. Similar to what John was saying on how a lot of data is being left on the cutting room floor, we also see this as an opportunity to engage with CMS, where I'm sure several of our generic and biosimilar manufacturer members would be happy to provide data that demonstrates specifically how and when their product was marketed. But our issue is the concern that there may be a potential threshold that they have to meet, which of course will be challenging because, as mentioned at the top, we already have issues set in place by the Part D structure that prevent generic and biosimilar manufacturers from getting their product into patients' hands originally. So that was one of the most interesting points that we saw. Secondly, in the 2-year delay process, we were also a little bit concerned because there is the ability for, amongst the rest of the process, that information is protected by FOIA, but it wasn't specific that the information submitted pursuant to the 2-year delay process would be FOIAble. And then also, we do believe that it's pro-patient for a biosimilar manufacturer to launch their product at risk. And there's some stipulations outlined within the guidance that potentially prohibit or inhibit that from happening and aligning with this negotiation process.
Thanks, Monet. Before we wrap up, let's wade a little bit deeper into the weeds and talk about these information collection requests. The data negotiation elements initial ICR was issued on March 21st in the Federal Register with comments due on May 22nd, 2023. The drug price negotiation process initial ICR is in the April 18th Federal Register with comments due on June 20th, 2023. So ICRs, Jason and John, are required by the Paperwork Reduction Act to address the burden of completing government forms. They normally don't get a lot of attention, and honestly, a lot of times they're a little bit hard to find when you're trying to track these things. What opportunity do you see for stakeholders in commenting on the ICRs issued for information collection under the program?
Well, Jim, I used to work in OSORA, so I want to give a shout out to all those people out there who are responsible for implementing the myriad Paperwork Reduction Act provisions. It's high time they're finally getting the attention that's due. But look, when it comes to health policy, the devil's in the details, and this process is normally not something that people pay attention to. But if the process set out by CMS makes it hard for patients and patient groups to engage in the discussion, or leaves out data from manufacturers and clinicians about the treatment impacts that matter most to patients, then this arcane process becomes a really important process. And when I look at forms that contain word limits on even people's ability to comment on these important topics, I get concerned. But I really want to give a shout out to Bob Nordyke and Julie Patterson on our team, who wrangled all of the important thinking on this topic and tried to fit it into the space that was provided.
Thanks. And Jason, what are the opportunities you see in commenting on these ICRs?
I mean, I think it's an opportunity for clarity. We've talked, all three of us, so much about just things are unclear. It's not, we're not sure exactly what CMS means by certain terms and certain asks and the evidence that they're looking for. So I think this is a big opportunity. And I think John's point's a good one about not just from the manufacturers, right, but also from the patient community, an opportunity, and for the public in general to really ask those questions or give some direction of where they think CMS should go when it comes to what their asks are going to be. So that, to me, that's the biggest opportunity, just provide clarity on what they're required.
Thanks, Jason. So let's wrap up with a couple of final questions. So let's start with Monet. What do you think CMS is doing right in implementing the program?
Yeah, CMS was met statutorily with a very tight timeline, and they are doing their best to push information out as rapidly as possible. The way they've reshaped the agency, the revised mood ring or the Medicare drug rebate negotiations group has been able to extract internal career staff with a deep understanding of the intricacies of rapid implementation of a complex policy, but they also brought in several subject matter experts from the industry to share the realities of the challenges of this law's execution. And that's been evident through the guidance released. And we hope to continue to have opportunities to align with policymakers because the initial stages of the implementation of this law is critical to the sustainability of this program.
Thanks, Monet. And then Jason, what is CMS doing right in implementing the program?
I'll build a little bit on what Monet said. I'll focus on two things. One is, they have the resources, so they're bringing in not only, I would say, subject matter experts in general, but even like they're employing, they're hiring health economists, right? Which they don't have a lot of, and that this would be helpful. And so that, because they're doing that, I'm a little bit more hopeful that they're going to focus on value, because that's, a lot what health economists do. So that's one thing. I would say the other thing is they've been very receptive to input. They have engaged all the stakeholders. How much of that is sustained engagement or just kind of a one-time check the box? It's hard to tell, but they've been very receptive. We've had many conversations with them. They're always asking for more information, more materials, being educated. So they've been very open to that. We're not going to know the effects of that or the impact of that until we see the implementation, to see how much actually they've listened to all the stakeholders, including us. But they have been very receptive to have conversations. They've never kind of, to my knowledge, they've never rejected a conversation with us or others. And so that openness and acknowledgement that they need to, they needed education, they need to learn some things. There's a lot that they don't know, I think has been really good for the process. And hopefully we'll be able to see, the impact of that in implementation.
Thanks. And John, what's CMS doing right in implementing this?
I would echo what Monet and Jason said in terms of they're working really hard under an incredibly tight timeline, and they're being very open to public input. We've appreciated every conversation we've had with them. It was great to see them at the ISPOR meeting. It's great to see some of their folks on this call today. And at the same time, I want to underline what Jason said about the importance of sustained engagement, sustained openness. I'm used to, at the close of a comment period, going to regulations.gov, opening a docket and reading what others have said. As of yet, I haven't been able to do this for this process. I've been emailing friends and collecting what other people have submitted. And look, I work at a research organization, and it's really important to see what other stakeholders are saying. And we've barely scratched the surface in hearing what patient groups have said is most important to them. So I would like the openness to continue and maybe even go a little bit farther.
Great. Thanks, John. And I can see we're out of time, so I have one final question for each of the panelists. We've gone pretty deep into the weeds today, and there's a lot of complicated issues, but like John said, health policy is the devil's in the details. So do you have one final thought that if the audience doesn't remember anything else you said today, you want them to remember? And let's start with Monet.
Well, in terms of the implementation of the negotiation provisions, we just like to see the market work how it was intended to work. The more low-cost options you have available, the more options there are for patients to continue to adhere to their medications.
Thanks, Monet. And Jason?
Again, I would just repeat, this is a great opportunity for CMS to kind of shape this environment. And I hope they would focus on value, particularly from the patient perspective, and not just focus on, the lowest price possible.
Thanks. And John, you get the final thought.
Again, we're living in a golden era of innovation, and this law isn't the first cut into the companies that are responsible for bringing this innovation to life. I feel like this law has the potential to nick an artery. We're making changes to the largest pharmaceutical marketplace in the world, the garden in the ecosystem that brings forward all the important innovation to the world. And I think we need to be very careful about the economic signals that we're sending so we don't disrupt it too terribly.
Thank you. So thank you to all three of our excellent panelists. You can, and then if you didn't get to watch today, or you have a colleague that you know didn't get to see this, we'll make this available online, so stay tuned. We'll have that link available shortly. And then also, please join us for our June forum. We'll send invitations out. And if you did not get an invitation to this directly and would like to, please let our team know. It'll be available in the chat. And we also have a newsletter you can sign up for that also includes information on these events. So thank you again to our three panelists, and I hope to see many of you next month.